Good Wednesday afternoon, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVinoSports.com, hosting our Week 3 early look college football. We will talk about some of the biggest games and the lines and what is going on midweek. But before we do that, we'll need to look back at some of the crazy endings and controversial plays from Week 2, and in order to do all of that, I need to bring in the founder and host of Rob Vino Sports, Rob Vino. Rob, how are you this afternoon?
Hey, I'm doing great, Rob. How about yourself?
Doing very well. Let's jump right into it. I think the most controversial ending of Week 2 belongs right down in Oklahoma State. Really cost them a game last week when they were allowed to have a fourth down. They throw a pass to nobody just to kill the clock. The refs call intentional grounding, award Central Michigan an untimed down, which they execute a Hail Mary lateral to win the game and stun Oklahoma State. Rob, first a little bit on the rule, and then a little bit on how this is going to impact Oklahoma State's season going forward.
Well, I tell you, Robin, watching the game, thank God Mike Pereira was in the booth to let everybody know what the rule was before anybody knew what the rule was. I've never seen that particular ending in a game before, so I was kind of watching and going along with the flow. The coaches didn't know the rule, the announcers didn't know the rule, but the ex-referee knew the rule, and certainly it's pretty evident, pretty clear. He read it right from the rule book that if a game ends with a penalty that includes loss of down, then the game is over at that point. There is no extension of the football game for an untimed down. Nobody knew that. Central Michigan got the extra play, the untimed down, and boy, they made the most of it. I mean, it was a heck of a play. The Hail Mary with the lateral, the 50 yards across field from one sideline to the other and into the end zone. But for OSU, that's just a heartbreaking loss that really isn't a loss. Not much they can do about it now. But when you're in the Big 12, Rob, and you don't have a conference championship game and you take a non-conference loss like that in a game that you've actually won, it just makes that road to get to the college football playoff that much tougher. Not that Oklahoma State was going to get there anyway, but should they run the table and become an 11-1 team, they'll have some pretty good victories along the way. And certainly that loss might hinder everything for them. So I think that Mike Gundy and his coaching staff probably wish that they knew the exact rule at the time that happened, because they could have stopped it. They could have prevented it, no doubt about it.
Well, I think it's interesting that Gundy came out and said, we're not going to play any more games without Big 12 or Power 5 officials as the officials, but I think he misses the point that there were Big 12 officials in the replay booth that could have stopped this as well, and they didn't do it either.
Yeah, there's a host of people, right? And again, if you're the head coach and you're going to come out and criticize and point the finger in other directions at other people that should have known, I mean, really, you should have known, to tell you the truth, or somebody on your staff should have known. So you could point the finger directly back at yourself if you're Mike Gundy. It's a shame because the victory is legitimately theirs, if not for the mess up. And so these MAC officials get suspended for, 2 weeks, Rob? I think they go on suspension for because of that.
2 weeks, and the replay officials got 2 weeks as well.
Yeah, and rightfully so. But I'll tell you one thing. Now everybody in the land knows that if they're on offense and they're protecting the lead on fourth down, you don't have to punt. You can intentionally ground the ball and end the game. So every team knows it now. Every coach knows the rule now. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it a little bit more now.
Very well could be. I guess another controversial decision, this time from a coaching perspective, would be BYU trailing Utah, come back, tie the game late. They are on the road, down a point. Instead of going for an extra point and looking at overtime. They go for 2 and the win, take a loss. My personal thoughts on it are, in most circumstances, I probably would agree with the decision to go for 2, but with the way college football is, where all that matters is winning every game and getting to the championship as an undefeated team, and BYU would absolutely have to be undefeated to get to even have a shot to get to the 4, playing an independent schedule and not having the brand, so to speak, that Notre Dame has, where one loss Notre Dame would be under a lot more consideration than a one-loss BYU team. I probably would have kicked the extra point and tried to get the win in overtime. Momentum appeared to be on the side of BYU at that point, and I don't think I'd want to put my whole season on the line on one play there when I didn't have to do it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm probably in your corner on that, Rob. I think that rivalry is so heated. You and I believe, talked about this game last week a little bit. To those that aren't in that mountain time zone and aren't geographically close to that rivalry, I don't think that you can get the full understanding of, how much like a Michigan State or an Ohio State-Michigan type of rivalry it is, Alabama-Auburn, any of those, Oklahoma-Texas, where there's real deep dislike for the other side. It exists with those two teams, and for new head coach Sitake, I think, and you never know what's going on inside a head coach's mind at the time that they make these calls, but I do think that maybe emotion played a huge role in that to make that decision. I would have kicked the extra point. There was no real, like you say, BYU probably had momentum at that point in time, and there was no real dominant force in the game. So it's not like the Jack Del Rio decision on Sunday afternoon against New Orleans, where his dilemma was, if I go for the tie, but then I lose the overtime coin toss, I probably lose the game because we can't stop Drew Brees. That really doesn't come into play with BYU, even though the overtime system is different. Their defense was playing far well enough to maybe hold Utah and win a game in overtime. So I probably would have kicked it, but I know the rivalry is what it is, and perhaps he just felt like his team at that point in time had enough going for it to get the 2 and get out of there with the victory. It's hard to criticize it, Rob. All I can really say is that I think if it were myself in that situation, I might have kicked. But you never know until you're standing there, right, faced with that thing with all the elements that are surrounding you.
Absolutely, and that's why these coaches get paid a lot of money to make these decisions right in the moment. And in retrospect, if they had got it and successfully converted it, we probably wouldn't have even brought it up on the show today.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, we saw so many things over the weekend that...
Well, I think the next thing, speaking of so many things over the weekend, is probably what turned out to be the best game of the weekend, Arkansas TCU. Arkansas controlled the game for a good portion well into the third quarter. Then they go and they miss a little field goal. Momentum totally swings in the direction of TCU after that. They come all the way back. They end up taking a 28-20 lead. Arkansas drives down the field, scores a touchdown. TCU drives back, has a chance to win. Their inexperienced kicker has a field goal block. They go to overtime. They match each other touchdown for touchdown. Go to the second overtime. TCU settles for field goal. Arkansas scores touchdown. Game over. But I think the biggest issue with this game was time management by TCU when they had the ball up 21-20. Would you have tried to kill more clock, or with that up-tempo offense, you just have to go?
Yeah, and that's the trouble with those offenses, right? They just don't know how to take the foot off the pedal. It's not in the nature of the guys calling plays. It's a little bit different, Rob, when we talk about these up-tempo or extreme tempo offenses. Some of them are mostly air raid with some run mixed in. TCU's a pretty good balance. And then some are like Gus Malzahn's in Auburn that are run-oriented. And I think the run-oriented up-tempo teams have a better chance at eating up some clock because they can slow it down through that running game a little bit more, take a little bit more time off when you're calling the signals at the line of scrimmage. But these air raid style teams, boy, they just don't know how to do it. All that's ever on their mind is attack, attack, attack. And if you score another touchdown, it's all well and good. But if you don't, then, of course, you leave yourself open to the other team getting the ball back very quickly and perhaps having some time for themselves. So I just, it's the nature of the beast. TCU is not going to let off the pedal. It's hard to teach a team like that to do it. But, hey, it would have come in handy, right? I mean, in overtime, they were still in pretty good shape. But their defense, Gary Patterson absolutely ripped his defense prior to the game, said that if they didn't improve off of week one, they'd give up 1,000 points and 1,000 yards to Arkansas. And they played real good until the very end. Those last two drives, the game-tying one in the fourth quarter and the overtime one, TCU's defense reverted back to that Civ-like unit that we've seen for a year plus now, and it wasn't very good timing for the defense. But you know what? When you're leaned upon by the physicality of Arkansas for that long a period of time, obviously TCU has given away a lot of size in that matchup. And it eventually caught up with them. Give Arkansas a lot of credit. They threw the ball well. Last year, when Brett Bielema went out and got Dan Enos, the head coach at the time of Central Michigan, to come be his offensive coordinator. So Enos leaves the head coaching job to become an offensive coordinator. Granted, it's moving from the MAC to the SEC, which is a big jump. But ever since Enos has gotten there, that offense has, the play calling and the diversity of that offense has really picked up. And we saw it on Saturday night. When they need to use the play action pass and move down the field, they can use a passing game now. When Brett Bielema first got there, they couldn't throw the football whatsoever. So that's a big win for Arkansas. Again, much like Oklahoma State, boy, that's a tough loss for TCU. I mean, TCU didn't lose it because of a referee call, but it's a game that it looked like in the fourth quarter with that huge comeback, they could have gotten out of there with a win.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing to realize is that Arkansas only had one timeout left when TCU got the ball back to go on their touchdown drive, and the fact that they either couldn't or chose not to try and work the clock really ended up coming back to hurt them at the end of the day. Does this mean Arkansas is a contender in the SEC West? At least in my opinion, not at this point. I think there's still too many good teams at the top of that division that they'd have to get through, but I think it proves that the program is definitely moving in the right direction.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, they're going to be a handful when they play any of those West teams. They're going to be a handful for Alabama. They'll be a handful for Ole Miss. They'll be tough on LSU. They always are. You can go right on down the lines throughout that division. Arkansas is just a tough opponent. I think that what kind of put them under the radar this season coming in, Rob, when you look at preseason projections for this team, was the amount of starters that they were returning on the offensive side. They lost a bunch, only bringing back 4 guys and only 2 on the offensive line. So a lot of people sort of dropped them to the bottom of that SEC West division when you go through magazines from the spring and summertime. However, sometimes you got to listen to the coach. And throughout the spring and throughout the summer, Brett Bielema was very, very confident in the experience that they returned. It doesn't show up in the starters, but it shows up in the returning lettermen. They had 56 guys coming back that have been in this program and earned varsity letters. 22 on the offensive side, 29 on the defensive side, and he was confident that he could plug and play. We know Brett Bielema from Wisconsin can develop offensive linemen pretty rapidly, and it looks like, when you have a guy like Dan Skipper leading the way, it's not that hard, but it looks to me like the coach was right, the prognosticators were wrong, and, the fact that they didn't lose opening day was a big deal. It was only a 21-20 win over Louisiana Tech, but if you just think back to last year, that same type of game, they blew to Toledo, and it kind of hurt them to start the season. So I think Arkansas is in the mix there. Hey, nobody's Alabama at this point in time, but as far as a team that can cause some trouble, a team that can pull a couple upsets should they be road underdogs, I think Arkansas fits the bill. We just saw it happen Saturday, plus 7.5, win a game straight up.
Well, speaking of the SEC West, one of the teams they're going to be going up against, LSU, pretty quick hook for Brandon Harris on Saturday night. He looked absolutely terrible in the couple of possessions he did get against a very weak Jacksonville State team. The game was delayed by weather. I don't think that had any effect on Harris's performance on the field. Les Miles made the move at QB. What do you think of that, Rob? Is that the best thing for the program moving forward? Do you think they'll ever go back to Harris or use Harris in more of a run option kind of situation, or do you think he's just done?
Yeah, I'll tell you who it's best for. It's best for that wide receiving duo of Doral and Dupree. Those two guys who can't seem to get the football, even though they're, listed by almost every draft expert or, these guys who work on the draft around the calendar 365 days a year. You're talking about two NFL wide receivers that don't make a difference in any game, really. Danny Etling, from watching him at Purdue, he's a better thrower, and they can loosen the reins on the offense a little bit. Well, let's see if they do now, right? Because certainly the offense is prehistoric, and, the offensive coordinator, Cam Cameron, is the guy who's come under the most fire lately because they just don't do anything to diversify that offense. But I think with Etling at quarterback, he's the more consistent thrower. He's the more accurate thrower. If the offensive line, his numbers on Saturday aren't going to wow anybody. But he did come right in and lead the team to 3 straight scores through a touchdown pass. And I think the more of these practice weeks that he gets to work out timing with the starting wide receivers, I think you're going to see these wide receivers make more of a difference in games now for LSU. Let's hope for LSU fans, let's hope for college football guys like yourself and myself. I'd love to see LSU not be as predictable. I'm sure Leonard Fournette would like LSU not to be as predictable. And this way, if teams gang up 8-9 in the box, which they do against Fournette, now you've got a quarterback and big play wide receivers that can make a difference. So I think it's a good move. I don't think the hook was too soon. LSU's playing for their lives right now, and they have to be drastic in their moves. I think that was a pretty drastic move, but certainly at least, what we know right now, or what I feel right now, I feel it was the right move. Only time will tell, but I think they did the right thing.
Any thoughts on why Georgia and Clemson both struggled so much against much inferior competition at home? Clemson with a 6-point win over Troy, Georgia with a 2-point win over Nichols. Any thought on either of those two programs? Was it just an off week looking ahead to bigger games, or is this a sign of some trouble to come for these two teams?
Well, let's start with Clemson. Certainly Deshaun Watson came out yesterday and pretty much pointed the finger at himself, blamed himself for the lack of offense the first 2 games of the season. You like to see that out of a player, not too egotistical to think that he's got nothing to do with it. I don't know that Deshaun Watson is the entire problem. I watched that game, Rob, every single play from first to fourth quarter because I had a vested interest in it. I had that game to go over the total of 63.5 or 64, and it was frustrating watching Clemson. Now, that being said, for those listening to the podcast tonight or tomorrow or anytime during the week who have gotten our college football betting guide this year, you'll know that there's a section in there where I listed 12 teams that I thought were going to be kind of under the radar and successful against the point spread this year. Troy was one of them, so I expected Troy to be better. Defensively, they looked really good. Now, it could be a combination of Clemson looking bad and Troy being better. We don't know Troy to be a good defensive team for a lot of years now. But they certainly looked the part in their front seven and in their secondary against Clemson on Saturday. The score's a lot closer because, like we saw from other players who did stupid things over the Saturday and Sunday football weekend, Ray McLeod for Clemson takes a punt back 75 yards and decides a step before he gets in the end zone that he's going to showboat and drop the ball on the 1 yard line. So there's a 7 that Clemson certainly could have made the score look a little bit better than it did at the end, but it's 7 that they didn't get because Troy recovered the ball, and when the play was reviewed, it got overturned, and it was Troy football. You can't have stupid mistakes. They looked lackluster, to say the least. They didn't look motivated. Dabo Swinney's got to do something with that team. It's almost, there's a cliche, and we've been around long enough, Rob, to know that, that there's that thought process where sometimes when you see teams like that, you think that they've read their own press clippings coming into the season. Prior to this season, the last time we saw Clemson, they were almost beating Alabama for a national title. And perhaps they went through the spring and perhaps they went through the summer practice sessions thinking that they were just going to cakewalk to that point in time again and get right back to the national championship. Well, these other two teams have come to play the first 2 weeks, Auburn and Troy, and Clemson has really not executed. Like I say, they look lackluster. They didn't look prepared. A lot of that rides on the shoulders of the coaching staff. We'll see if it straightens out. Certainly, they got away with a couple of victories, but at this point in time, I'll tell you what, you tell me if I'm right or wrong, but at this point in time, it would seem as if Deshaun Watson, for the time being, has played himself right out of Heisman Trophy consideration, and he was one of the top 2 people or one of the top 2 players on almost everybody's mind just 2 weeks ago. So it's been that bad offensively for Clemson. The defense has bailed them out. I don't want to sit here and scold the entire team because the defense has played well, but offensively they just have not looked like they're ready to play a football game yet.
Well, I can't disagree with you on that. And what do you think about Georgia and only a 2-point win at home, coming off a big win against North Carolina? Just a little bit of a letdown or something more?
Yeah, and there's probably a little more. I mean, letdown certainly. I think that has to be part of it. These things are never cut and dry, just one reason. But I think there's a couple of things here. Let's just remember that this is a team that's gone through a complete coaching overhaul. We're only 2 weeks into the season. You got a brand new head coach in Kirby Smart. You got brand new offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. Now, they played well against a very good North Carolina team. Nick Chubb went crazy. You can, in college football and in pro football, we see this all the time where a team gives a maximum effort, 100% focus, and they can't match that effort and focus the following week. So that goes right with the letdown theory, and there's bigger fish to fry for Georgia down the road. So perhaps your game planning during the week, you sort of skip right by Nicholls State and look on your calendar, who am I playing after that, and maybe we can get ready for that team. So I think there's a lot of pieces that went into it. I wouldn't discount Georgia because of it, because I think we saw them at their best able to win by double digits over a real good North Carolina team. The Nicholls State, it should have been a blowout, but they're not that good of an FCS team either, Rob. That's another thing that's kind of baffling, to only win by 2. Even if you just show up, you should win by more than 2 against Nicholls State. They're not one of your better FCS teams. They're not one of the, they're a bottom feeder in the Southland Conference, their own conference. So, it's disappointing, but I don't know that we can draw anything from it yet because Georgia does have extenuating circumstances, especially, like I say, the fact that they're going through a major system overhaul down there, and we'll see. They got a quarterback controversy still going on. It looks like maybe Jacob Eason's the guy, but when you don't make a decision on that either, it's kind of tough, right? Nobody gets into a rhythm.
Yeah, that is always an issue, and I think that'll pretty much do it for what we saw last week, Rob. Let's move ahead and talk about some games this coming weekend. We've identified 6 we want to talk about. I'm going to do them in the order of largest point spread to smallest point spread. So we're going to start with Alabama and Ole Miss. Alabama coming off a 38-10 win over Western Kentucky. Ole Miss coming off a very similar game, a 38-13 win over Wofford. I think if you had asked me what the spread on this game would have been at halftime of the Ole Miss-Florida State game, I would have pegged it at about 4 to 5 points. Then Florida State really just put on the gas, and Mississippi imploded in the second half, and that leaves us with 10.5 as our number thereabouts for this weekend. What are your thoughts on the game, Rob?
Well, I'll start with the power ratings. My power ratings made Alabama an 11-point favorite. The opener, as you said, was 9. So the money, the bettors certainly have been in agreement with the minus 11 suggested by the power rating here. So maybe that was the more accurate number to start with, and people probably saw a little bit of value in Alabama. You know, it's a game where I think you could make enough argument, Rob, to go ahead and bet Alabama because they've lost 2 games in a row to Ole Miss. You expect this team to be fired up. I think we've seen after 2 weeks that Alabama at their best, that 52-3 destruction of USC, which basically took place in 3 quarters because Alabama didn't score a point in the first quarter.
You could even be generous. That took place in 2.5 quarters because it was still 3-0 midway through the second.
Right. So you're talking about a team that can beat a team like USC 52-3 over the course of 2.5 quarters. That's a real good football team. Jalen Hurts looks like the quarterback that they've settled upon, so that's been solved. Certainly Nick Saban, a lot's been made of that sideline. We won't even call it a discussion that he was having with Lane Kiffin at the end of the Western Kentucky game last week. There's those that believe that was simply no more than motivation for this upcoming game against Ole Miss. Nick Saban, always good at the psychology end of coaching his team, maybe got through with that to the coaching staff, to the players, that this was going to be an important week. You know, Ole Miss, if they had a little more of a running game, I think that they'd be a legitimate outright threat here. They do have the home field. They do know that they can play with Alabama. They have the, one of the nation's best quarterbacks in Chad Kelly. They have a great defensive front seven. There's a lot of good things going for Ole Miss. But I come back to the lack of a running game. Last year in that 43-37 game, they didn't really have a running game either. But they managed to get out to a huge lead. A lot of Alabama mistakes in that game, and they hung on for dear life at the end. Like I say, 43-37. A repeat of that could certainly happen. I mean, this team at home is good enough to beat anybody. But I think what bettors are seeing, watching the number go up over the course of the last 2-3 days, I think they're just seeing a better fundamental football team in Alabama with some situational advantages here. Most of that coming from the fact that they're trying to redeem themselves for 2 losses to Ole Miss. It's a divisional game. This game means the world to Ole Miss, too, because like you mentioned, they've already had the loss to Florida State. If they lose twice, they're done. Their dreams of getting into the Final Four for the college football playoff are finished. So huge for both sides. I kind of understand why the line has gone up, but I don't know. All that being said, I don't know that I'd be willing to lay it. I think I'd be more apt to take 10.5 with the home team than I would lay it with Alabama. Alabama could win the game by 1, 3, 7, but 10.5 just sounds like a lot to me.
I'm kind of in the same boat as you. When I saw it get up into double digits there, I started to take a hard look to see if there might be a little bit of a play on Ole Miss there. Let's move along. We're going to go all the way out to the West Coast now for a matchup between USC and Stanford. Stanford coming off of a early season bye. USC coming off a pretty impressive 45-7 win against Utah State. Stanford just under a double-digit favorite here, laying about 9 points at a lot of the sports books out there. What do you see in this one, Rob?
Well, I thought that, Stanford was underrated coming into the season, Rob. Again, when I put together that top 12 list of teams that I thought could be successful against the point spread, I put Stanford in there simply because what I saw over the summer from lines like Golden Nugget College Football Game of the Year lines, when I went through all of those, it looked like Stanford was just a little bit disrespected or downgraded too heavily. Let's put it that way. We know they lost a lot to the NFL, but not a terrible, not an Ohio State amount. You know what I mean? I kept thinking to myself, it seems like this downgrade is predicated on the fact that they lost Kevin Hogan. I watched Kevin Hogan for 3 years play quarterback for Stanford. Until his senior year, second half, wasn't the most impressive quarterback going. Stanford won games at some times despite Kevin Hogan. So, to know that they had the two highly touted kids coming into the season, Keller Christ and Ryan Burns, I didn't downgrade them that badly power ratings-wise. In fact, not much at all, because the defense was still there, and certainly Christian McCaffrey's still there. What we saw in the opening game against Kansas State was an absolute terror of a defense. The numbers that they put up against K-State in that game, and it feels like it was so long ago, right? I mean, that game was played on the opening night, I think, and the defense showed us that they're still going to be that aggressive, swarming, disruptive style team. In that game, they had 8 sacks, 7 quarterback hurries, 10 tackles for loss, 2 interceptions, and 10 passes broken up. Now, K-State's not the best throwing team in the world, but Bill Snyder's teams are well coached, and to put up those types of numbers really is kind of crazy. It shows how strong that defense is. Flip it now to this game on Saturday against USC, which to me is, they finally got their numbers straight, right? They got 85 people on that football team. All the sanctions are gone. They're finally able to recruit everywhere and gain some depth. But the offense is the strength of that team. If you're talking about, NFL-type talent, it's on the offensive side of the football. The one problem, of course, is you have Max Brown, a highly touted kid, but he's coming into college football for the first time. Didn't look great after the first quarter of the Alabama game. And if you're going to draw a comparison to Alabama somewhere else in the country, I think the direct correlation is Stanford. It's a physical football team that plays the game much like Alabama does. They want to beat you up in the trenches. They want to be able to run the ball down your throat. They can throw off of the run. I think Alabama might be a little more diverse in their offensive playbook now that Lane Kiffin's there calling plays, but still, Stanford's a pretty effective play-action passing team. And to see USC get steamrolled so bad by Alabama for those 2.5 quarters, it leads me to believe that Stanford, with their physicality and their nature, style of play, that they could almost do the same. The other thing to consider here, and I had this discussion the other day, Rob, on the Sports Memo podcast, was the wondering amongst a lot of people right now is if Clay Helton is going to survive this whole thing. When Clay Helton was named head coach, or when the decision process was being made as to who to hire to be the head coach, boy, there's a lot of that USC fan base, alumni, media, that didn't want Clay Helton. They wanted a bigger name in there, but Clay Helton got the job off of what he did to straighten things out last year after Sarkisian got fired, right? so he got the job. But it seems like the team isn't really totally under control, right? You saw a kid for USC punch a referee on Saturday, and the practice sessions leading up to that game, kids were walking off the field. It just seems like there's a lot of disruption, and maybe the head coach doesn't have a tight enough leash around this entire team. We'll see. Could just be isolated incidents, but I kind of fall into the camp that maybe Clay Helton isn't a strong enough voice for the 85 players that he has on that team. This is an important game in the Pac-12, so we won't judge him until this result comes in. But everything I know right now, I think Stanford's the better team. Stanford's had a week off to get ready. Stanford's at home, and I think they're a shade underrated. So I'm going to look towards the Stanford side in that game. Now we might get burnt by Schuster and Dory Jackson and these guys, but I think I'd take my chances.
Moving along to another team that has had a bye week to prepare for a opponent, Michigan State Notre Dame. The line is Notre Dame minus 7.5, yet Michigan State ranked ahead of Notre Dame in both the coaches and the AP poll. What do you make of this line and what's going on with this game, Rob?
Well, personally now, from the power ratings that I make, and I've been doing this since 92, so we're talking about 24 years now, Notre Dame at home should only be a 3.5-point favorite according to power ratings. So certainly my eyes were opened when I saw the opener, 7.5. Can't really figure it out. You add to that mix that Michigan State got great news during their bye week that Ed Davis, arguably their best linebacker, was granted a 6th year of eligibility because of injuries he suffered throughout his career. You tack him on to that defense, and all of a sudden that front seven becomes a Michigan State front seven, very dominant. According to head coach D'Antonio, there's a real likelihood that Davis is going to play in this game. So I think that makes a little bit of trouble for Notre Dame. You have to have that kind of defense against the Fighting Irish, Rob, because you watch them play and you pretty much figure out quickly that they can move the football on anybody. So you want to be able to have a defense good enough to make those few extra stops that are necessary, because when you turn the ball the other way and your offense is going up against their defense, Brian Kelly's got troubles. And that defense was exposed by Texas. And Nevada, that's another story, that game last week. Head coach Brian Polian, I don't really have a lot of positives about him. I think he's absolutely destroyed everything that Chris Ault brought to that program, including that prolific pistol offense. So they didn't really have the tools to exploit it. But Michigan State's got the tools to exploit it, especially the secondary. Notre Dame, last season the secondary was a mess. Heading into this season, they thought they had a couple of things solved, but a key injury, off-field incidents right before the season started, which took Max Redfield, their starting free safety, and kicked him off the team, right? 23 career starts gone. And all of a sudden you watch Texas throw the ball all over the lot with a freshman quarterback against him. So I think there's definitely chances for Michigan State to have big plays in this game. I think the defense tightens up a little bit with Ed Davis, and I'm not saying they're going to win, but that's a large number, right? That's a large number, 7.5. And I see some 8s out there right now as we speak, Rob. So Notre Dame's attracting money. Just can't quite understand why. Power ratings tell me it shouldn't be that high. And I think fundamentally you can make the argument Michigan State could play toe-to-toe with Notre Dame, no problem.
I agree. I will definitely be putting a few wagers in on Michigan State this weekend. We move down now. We're going to get into some games with some much tighter point spreads. We'll start back in the SEC. We've got Texas A&M and Auburn. We've got Auburn about a 3.5-point favorite. Texas A&M coming off a very good win, 67-0 against Prairie View. I mean, not the greatest of competition, but a good 67-0 win nonetheless. And Auburn coming off a 41-14 win against Arkansas State. What do you see in this one, Rob?
Well, it's a big game, and no doubt about it, for both sides. Again, when you're in the SEC West, every single game where you play a divisional opponent is a dogfight, and to get to the top of that pile, it's a long, hard road. I like Texas A&M this year. I think that they went through a lot of distraction last year. The results weren't good. Kevin Sumlin had people calling for his head. Quarterbacks were transferring out of there like you couldn't believe. They couldn't get out of there fast enough. And somehow they've righted the ship this year. They've got too much talent to not be a good team. And what they've done this season is they've tried to up their tempo even faster than what they had been playing before. Brought in Noel Mazzoni as offensive coordinator, and he immediately stated that he wants to run 90 plays per game. So I think when you look at it from that fundamental perspective, Auburn's strength on the defensive side of the football, and we saw this against Clemson, is their defensive line. They've got a tremendous defensive front. I think what A&M is going to try to do tactically in that game, Rob, is they're going to try and run as many plays as they can and get that defensive line tired, tongues hanging, ragged, looking for substitution. There's some depth to that defensive line, but I don't know that it's enough if A&M can successfully churn out first downs through that short passing game, some on the ground because they're a pretty diverse pass-run team. And if they can do that to Auburn, you wonder where the Auburn answer is going to be from their offense. It's just not a good offense right now. Again, quarterback situation there. Sometimes Sean White's in, sometimes Johnson's in. You just don't know who's going to play quarterback. Like you said earlier, big win last week, but I don't know what we can draw from it. They scored a lot of points. Malzahn's an offensive wizard, and you expect at some point in time that he'd be able to put a potent offense out there, but the bad quarterback play in his system just hasn't allowed that to happen. He needs a dual-threat quarterback, and a legitimate dual-threat quarterback to be able to run that thing. A&M, John Chavis' second season as defensive coordinator running that team. I think A&M, when you have Myles Garrett and the defensive end bookends that they have on that team, it causes a lot of trouble for a team like Auburn in a bad down and distance situation. So I think fundamentally I could argue to you that Texas A&M is a better team, but you still have to go on the road. And we saw Auburn at home play Clemson system-wise, offensively, a team very similar to Texas A&M, and Auburn's defense did the job against them. But I don't know that it happens here. I really think A&M is the right side.
Now we get into a very big battle early in the season in the ACC. ACC made some other news this week announcing they are pulling all their championships, but obviously the one with the most significance is the ACC Conference Championship out of North Carolina, looking for another home for it. Two teams hoping to play in that game, Florida State and Louisville. Florida State, a small road favorite by about 2 points or so. Florida State coming off a 52-8 win against Charleston Southern, and Louisville coming off a 62-28 victory against Syracuse. How do you see this game playing out, Rob, in what is a huge early season matchup?
Well, tell me quick, are you a firm believer in Lamar Jackson right now, Rob?
I would have to say yes at this point in time.
We're going to get a good look at him because the first two games, certainly there's no defensive resistance put up, right? Charlotte's a bad defensive team. We saw Syracuse. Dino Babers is not a coach with his system that's going to, as an underdog and as a heavy underdog, he's not going to try to win a game by grinding clock and limiting Louisville possessions. We saw Syracuse just go toe-to-toe with them, same style. Louisville's just better right now than Syracuse is, and they wind up scoring 62. Jackson looks great again. Now you're going to face a real defense He's going to have to be accurate with the football, throwing it. And I think more than that, Rob, I'm interested to see how the Louisville defense holds up against the Florida State offense now that Deondre Francois has got things going there. He looked pretty ragged in the first half of the Ole Miss game. We talked about that earlier. But since then, he's looked really good. And the other pieces are there. Dalvin Cook, one of the top running backs in the country. And, of course, the receiving corps very good, too, led by Rudolph. So we're going to see. They're finally stepping way up in competition. But the atmosphere is going to be great. Having home field advantage at Papa John is going to be huge for Louisville. And if they get off to a fast start, and perhaps they can ride that, but I think they'd have to. I think we've seen Florida State already. They've set a precedent for us. They've shown us that they can get behind against a really good team and behind by multiple scores, because Ole Miss was really destroying Florida State in the first half of that football game.
28-6 at one point.
A 22-point lead that they overcame against a really, really good football team. So Florida State's no joke. I don't think that Louisville is either. I'm just curious to see if the step up in class doesn't affect them. And we'll see. You know, the kid's going on the road, Francois, for the first time too, Robert, in a very hostile environment, and perhaps mistakes will be made. But I'm just not – I don't know that I have a good enough feel yet on that Louisville defense and whether or not they can really take it to the Florida State offense. If I felt like I had a lot of confidence in that Louisville defense, I don't think I'd have any trouble going in and maybe money line playing Louisville to win at home straight up. It's a small point spread anyway. But that defense to me is a little bit of a concern, and I guess the same could be said for the Florida State side, right? Because Chad Kelly and company went up and down the field. So maybe you look toward the over in that game. Where was it? I think it was sitting somewhere around 64 or 65 points, which would force you to
65 and a half, even some 66s out there right now. So a lot of money seems to be coming in on the over, at least early in the week here.
So people have pushed it, money's pushed it, and at that number, I guess you're asking both sides to get to 34, and you have to legitimize that in your mind if you're going to play it. Do you really believe that both sides can get to 34? You know, and Jackson looks like he can get to 34 on just about anybody right now, and I think Florida State looks the same as well. So we'll put a little more into that game, but certainly, as you said, that's huge. That's an Atlantic Division game that could ultimately decide who goes to the ACC championship game. Certainly Clemson is the third team in that mix in the Atlantic Division, but this is an early September monster game. I'd be interested in the result. We'll look into it a little further, but I think you can make arguments for both sides. Louisville, certainly, Bobby Petrino has got them heading in the right direction. There's no doubt about it.
And finally, I think probably the biggest game of the week, Ohio State going to Oklahoma. Ohio State, the smallest of road favorites at this point against an Oklahoma team who's in a very similar situation to Ole Miss, where expectations high, and if they lose this game, their season is over. They enter in off a 59-17 win against Louisiana Monroe. Ohio State coming off a weather-delayed 48-3 victory against Tulsa. I mean, I don't think anything needs to be said about the importance of this game and the quality of the programs and the coaching staffs. What do you see happening here, Rob?
Yeah, we'll start with the power ratings. Power ratings made this game Ohio State minus a half a point. The game opened -2, and we've seen money come towards where the power ratings are. Money's come in on Oklahoma. You can find a pick at Pinnacle. There's some 1s and 1.5s out there. So money has slowly come in on the Oklahoma Sooner side. It's another interesting game. You're absolutely right in the fact that, like Ole Miss, it's a team, and this team came in probably with even higher expectations when you consider that they were pretty much universally labeled as a top 5 team, right? Oklahoma heading into the year. Ole Miss makes it into the top 15 in most polls preseason, but OU, off of last year's loss to Clemson when they made the Final Four, had a lot to prove this year. Baker Mayfield's coming back. Lincoln Riley's second year running the air raid. Looks like everything's in place for this team. The backfield of Joe Mixon, Samaje Perine, you could argue is the best running back combination in the nation. And, they've already lost a game. So it's life or death for them. It's on their home field, and it's the first true road game for all the Ohio State kids. We've seen the talent, we've seen the speed through the first 2 weeks, but I don't know that they could have had the schedule tailor-made any better for themselves. They played Bowling Green week 1, right? Bowling Green is a team that's been a kingpin in the MAC conference for the last 3-4 years, but just devastated by graduation. I believe they only returned 3 guys on offense, and the defense was decimated. So you kind of knew with a new head coach, Dino Babers got out just in time, right? Mike Jenks comes in from Texas Tech and has to try and plug things in. And Bowling Green obviously is not an Ohio State where, your depth is 4 deep and you just plug and play. They've got to get new guys in there. So they played Ohio State in week 1, and they play a rapid pace offense, which really fed into Ohio State scoring 77 points in that game. Come back and play Tulsa, and Philip Montgomery's team, again, can't run plays fast enough. Feeds right into Ohio State. Game was kind of close for about a half, and then all of a sudden Ohio State blows them out 48-3. It's a real test here. Again, it's a speedy team in Oklahoma in terms of how fast they want to run plays. This will be the 3rd extreme tempo team Ohio State plays in a row, except this one far more capable physically and speed-wise to give Ohio State's defense fits. We don't know, we don't know how good the defense is yet because of all the replacements that have been made. We know the kids are talented. Urban Meyer has said to anybody that'll listen, it's the most talented team he's ever had. But youth and inexperience on the road can make some mistakes. The good news for Ohio State is the guy standing under center is J.T. Barrett, and he's not going to get rattled at Oklahoma. So there's a calming force for you on the offensive side. It's really an interesting game, but I think if you use the cornered animal analogy for Oklahoma, that you would expect them to at home be able to win this football game, by a field goal, by a point, by a field goal, by something, any means necessary. If Ohio State wins it, Rob, if they go to Norman and win this game, and let's just say they win it by 10 points, I think the race is on between Ohio State, Michigan for that conference title, and then Alabama for a championship. I think heading in here to this season, a lot of people, maybe a good 90-95% of the people who follow college football just didn't think that Ohio State might be able to win a national title this year with all the losses that they had. But, boy, I'll tell you what, a win here would change everybody's mind, and they'll be right up top of the list with, like I say, with the Michigans of the world, with the Alabamas of the world. I think that those 3 would probably rate as your favorites if Ohio State could pull off a win here.
I don't disagree with that. I'm a little skeptical that Ohio State will be able to pull off the win. Like you said, Oklahoma is a very desperate football team. I think that Baker Mayfield has the experience and the poise to play very well in this game. He hasn't thrown an interception yet this year. Even with the loss to Houston, he still looked relatively good in that game. They didn't lose the Houston game because of anything Baker Mayfield did. I think when you look at the running game with Mixon and Perine, I think that if Oklahoma State were to be able to build some type of lead, they've got the talent to be able to kind of keep the ball out of Ohio State's hands if that's the route they elect to go. I think that this is a very good defense as well on Oklahoma that will be able to get some stops and I think it's going to be a very good game, but I would look for Oklahoma to probably come out on the right side of this one.
Yeah, and I would, at this point in time, I'd agree, Rob. There's a couple more things we could add to that. When they lost to Houston, and I'm not saying Ohio State's not motivated to come in here and win, but I don't know if the motivation could be any more than what the Houston Cougars was opening day. Houston's a team that is trying to get themselves into the Big 12 because the road to a spot at the table for a national championship is much easier to get to from a Power 5 conference than it is from the AAC. The last time Houston had played, it was a win over Florida State in a bowl game, and they wanted to come out immediately and show the nation that it was no fluke. And, the second half of that game, Oklahoma disappeared. It's not like they weren't in that game in the first half. They were winning that game in the first half. But the second half, their offense sputtered and sputtered and sputtered. I think Houston just got to him. Tom Herman's an excellent head coach. Don't think that Tom Herman won't relay what he learned about Oklahoma in that opening game to Urban Meyer. This was his offensive coordinator just 2 years ago. So there's a lot of conversation back and forth between Herman and Meyer, giving Meyer some ideas of what to look for from OU. That's helpful to the Ohio State side. But when
Rob, I just want to counteract that with one point. I'm sure that they've talked, but from a Houston standpoint, they want Oklahoma to win this football game.
Yeah, I guess you could say that for sure, because it helps open the door for them. Anybody who's undefeated and with a chance to be one of those Final Four teams at the end of the year, since Houston wants to be one of those, you want those people to get knocked off for sure. I don't know that a one-loss Ohio State team, if they go to Norman and lose a close game, if at the end the committee would select an undefeated Houston over a one-loss Ohio State at that point, because if that happens, Ohio State would have a lot of great victories throughout the season that would be helpful to them.
I think it's more from the aspect and the angle of if Oklahoma were to finish 11-1 and Houston were to finish 12-0, Oklahoma would be probably still going to the playoff, but then it'd be a lot harder to leave Houston at 12-0 out after they beat Oklahoma heads up. And if Oklahoma ends up with 3 or 4 losses at the end of the season and Houston is undefeated, all of a sudden that Oklahoma win doesn't look nearly as impressive in December when the committee's making their final selections as it does now in September.
You know what? It's a great point, and it's great to try and think ahead to what the committee might be seeing. Because just think about that. Let's say Oklahoma wins this game, they go 11-1. Ohio State loses this game on the road, they go 11-1. Houston runs the table, they go 12-0. For the Houston Cougars, on their resume, they'll cling to one victory. We beat Oklahoma, because the rest of the teams they're going to beat, there's not going to be anything impressive about beating Tulane, Tulsa, Navy, all the garbage that's in there, Western Side, SMU, when they get into conference play. For Ohio State, if they were to go 11-1, they're going to say, hey, we beat Michigan State, we beat Michigan, who are right in their division. Their wins are going to be more impressive. And then, of course, like you say, you would have Oklahoma at 11-1 with a win over Ohio State, and then some big wins in the Big 12. So let's just say, and we're talking way in advance. But if that were the situation come November, and only 2 of these 3 teams can go, which 2 do the committee select? It's a great question. They would have to hash that out at that point. And certainly, back to your main point, was the rooting interest for Houston would be Oklahoma winning the football game. Whether or not that stops communication between Meyer and Herman, I don't know if relationships are stronger than rooting for a team, or rooting for a team is stronger. Be an interesting thing as well. Nonetheless, I think you and I are on the same wavelength here, where Ohio State's the team that's got something to prove, right? Because You talked about Mixon and Pirine and maybe being able to control some clock through the ground game, even though they're a up-tempo team that runs a play every 17, 18 seconds. You can still grind out first downs with that running game. And we don't know if the Ohio State front seven is good enough to match up and stop that running game if Oklahoma should have a lead. So questions will be answered for sure come Saturday, and a lot of the stuff we have to do as we try to be proactive when we play these games, either you leave it alone and you say, I'm going to learn from it, or you really have a definitive side that you think, or a definitive opinion about these two teams that you think is right, and you go ahead and play it. If it were me, Rob, at this point in time, I'm going to say that I think both offenses are better than the opposing defenses, and I think we're going to see a lot of speed and a potential track meet in that game, which would lead me to put the over into consideration here. It opens 64.5. It's been played down in a couple of spots already, down to 63. So the money doesn't agree with my thought on the game. Doesn't mean it can't come back the other way. But I would look at it as J.T. Barrett's not going to be rattled. They'll move the football. They'll score points. And Oklahoma on the other side, against an untested defense with Baker Mayfield running the show, they'll probably score their share of points too.
Rob, I think that sums up the biggest game of the day very well. We've talked about some big ones. There's a lot of other good games out there this weekend. The card is not nearly as soft as the Week 2 card was. So let's each have a little time here for an under-the-radar game. I'm going to go with out to the West Coast. I always feel there's a little bit of an East Coast bias. Everybody's focusing in on those games. But I think there's a really interesting game out west in UCLA and BYU. We talked about BYU earlier. They go for 2. They don't get it. They don't beat Utah. For all intents and purposes, BYU's season is done now. It'll be interesting to see how they bounce back from that very tough loss against a UCLA team that's pretty darn good. They looked okay against UNLV. It wasn't the most impressive of victories, but you go back to their loss to Texas A&M in Week 1. Texas A&M's a really good program. They were down 24-9. They battled all the way back to tie that game up. They're going to be laying 3 on the road at BYU, and I think that's going to be a really fun game to watch after the main events end on Saturday evening. Do you have any thoughts on that one, Rob?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. You know, for the UCLA side, we saw Josh Rosen opening day. I don't think it could have gotten any tougher for him. Here's a guy who's one of the nation's elite quarterbacks. Basically, the offense is thrust upon his shoulders. The success of the offense is thrust upon his shoulders. He's lost all his wide receivers from the year before. He's working with a brand-new wide receiving core. He's got a brand-new running back because Perkins is off to the NFL, right? And here he is in College Station, Texas, against what I described before, John Chavis's defense, with a pass rush as good as any out there, a true SEC pass rush, a true SEC defensive line, and guys like Myles Garrett that are going to end up playing on Sunday. So it was as tough a situation as you could get for Josh Rosen. They didn't show much, right? It's about the 4:30 mark of the fourth quarter where they finally get a touchdown. They were trailing 24-9 at the time. They make it 24-16. They get the ball back, and then he throws kind of a flukish 62, 64-yard touchdown pass. But he comes back to tie the game in a hostile environment and in a game where the matchups didn't really suit him. So give Rosen credit for that. Last week, they opened up a huge lead early. I think UNLV, it might have been 42-7 or 42-14, but the final score looks a lot closer than the game really was. And it's a learning process for that offense. They'll catch BYU probably at a good time, right, because BYU comes off that holy war, that rivalry game where they put all of their effort into it, and now they have to bounce back. So it's good situationally for UCLA, and I think as the weeks go by, Rosen and his timing with those receivers gets a little better. Boy, by the time they hit conference play, and by the time middle of the season comes especially, they may be clicking on all cylinders. So I think that's a pretty good under-the-radar game, no doubt about it.
Do you have an under-the-radar game for us, Rob?
I think Georgia and Missouri, we talked about Georgia before, right? And you question the 2-point victory over Nicholls State, and, I tried to make half a case for why they would only win by 2, but there really is no case. If you and I were in a court of law and we were arguing both sides of that, you'd win that. I can't argue it enough to convince anybody that Georgia should only beat Nicholls by 2 points. They have to go to Columbia, Missouri now against a defense that, heading into the season, was extremely highly touted, but to tell you the truth, hasn't really lived up to their billing yet. Charles Harris, defensive end for Missouri, got more publicity during the offseason for what he did last year, and so far he's been a relative no-show. So I think that maybe Mizzou saving some stuff for the SEC. It's an SEC East game, but I would expect the defense to turn it loose against a new quarterback, Jacob Eason. They're certainly going to gang up on Nick Chubb. You're going to see 8-9 guys in the box, and whether or not Georgia's offensive line can push them around like they did North Carolina and use that running game to propel them to victory, that's something we have to see. The other side of that coin is Missouri scored 61 points last week. Okay, they scored 61 against Eastern Michigan, who basically played a lot of zero coverage, which means no safeties back there, and Drew Lock was going up top all day long. But, Missouri couldn't complete those passes in practice for a long, long time. And we saw some of those being completed. I think this new Josh Heupel offense suits Drew Lock, the quarterback, a lot better. There's a slew of young receivers on that Missouri team. We saw a couple come into their own against Eastern Michigan. Now, again, we don't want to place too much emphasis on beating Eastern Michigan because the week before, Mizzou was in West Virginia, and they only wound up with 11 points. So you have to kind of temper that 61 last week. But for me, what I'm seeing off of 2 games is I'm seeing the Missouri offense adapting to the system much better than they did last year's. I think they're coming along. Georgia, Kirby Smart's a great defensive coach. So it's a good matchup, As far as an under-the-radar game goes, I really think this one could be interesting. Is Georgia's last week result indicative of maybe some problems learning offense and defense, or is the week 1 result more indicative when they beat North Carolina? And for Mizzou, same thing. Remember that Mizzou did have a chance with about a minute and a half left in that West Virginia game, fourth quarter. They're down 26-11. They've got first and goal on the 6-yard line with a chance to cover the 10-point number, but they threw 4 straight incompletes and didn't get there. Then bounced back at home last week with a big win. So I'm interested, Rob, in that game. I'm interested to see if Mizzou has made progress, and certainly interested to see what Georgia's going to be with Jacob Eason at quarterback and under Kirby Smart as the head coach.
And finally, Rob, as we wrap it up for this week, there are a lot of big top 25 matchups. Anybody that should be on upset alert this weekend?
Well, for me, and I know you've got one as well, but for me, I talked at length about it already when we discussed the Michigan State-Notre Dame game. I really think that Michigan State's got a legitimate shot to win that game. Notre Dame's a real good football team, don't get me wrong, but I just don't feel like Michigan State is outclassed in that game in any way, shape, or form. I don't think that their defense is overwhelmed by the Notre Dame offense, and I don't think that Michigan State's offense is overwhelmed by the Notre Dame defense. Really, all that leaves you with is home field, and Michigan State's had an extra week to prepare for this game, and they get Ed Davis back at linebacker. So for me, I think if I were Notre Dame, and I know you put them on upset alert week 1, and sure enough, they did lose to Texas, I'll follow your lead. I'll put them on upset alert at home here in week 3 against Michigan State.
Well, based on the point spread, I'm not sure how big of an upset mine would really be, but I really do feel that Louisville has a chance to beat Florida State and throw a monkey wrench into this ACC race and kind of insert themselves into the Clemson-Florida State conversation in terms of who's going to be the champion of that conference. True road game for Florida State. Louisville has the ability to score as many points as they need to stay in the game. You would think that Florida State quarterback, first time on the road, could make a mistake or two. I really think that this game might come down to who has the ball last, and I think if it's Louisville, they're going to have a chance to pull off a relatively small upset in terms of the point spread, but a relatively big upset in terms of the playoff race in college football.
Yeah, it would turn things upside down. There's no doubt about it. And at this point in time, Rob, I don't know how you could significantly disagree with Louisville having a legitimate chance at home. From what we've seen so far, they've set the table with their monster victories, and they've set the table with the play of their quarterback. Nobody knew Lamar Jackson's name from the standpoint of just the common college football fan, and now everybody knows his name because the major networks, broadcast media, news media is starting to tout him as a potential Heisman Trophy candidate. So, like I say, Louisville set the table. They put themselves in a good spot. Now they got to go out and do the job against a team that's been, king of that conference for a long, long time. I know Clemson won it last year, but for the most part, you win the ACC by going through Florida State, and that's what Louisville's going to try to do this Saturday.
Well, Rob, I think we do have to mention one more game here before we go. I think that our third partner on the website, Derek Davis, who does not participate in this particular podcast with us, he might be a little disappointed to hear if we did not talk about Pitt and Oklahoma State. Pitt obviously coming off of a hold-on-for-dear-life victory at the end against Penn State in what was a huge rivalry finally renewed in the state of Pennsylvania. We've already covered Oklahoma State coming off of the heartbreaking loss on the play that should have never been. Can Oklahoma State regroup? Is Pitt in for a bit of a letdown here? Should be another good game this weekend.
Yeah, and I actually did the full free play write-up on this game, Rob, so we can certainly have our listeners read the in-depth written version of this. I'll try and give you basically the Reader's Digest version of what I wrote and what I felt when I wrote the play, but I recommended in the free play that you play Oklahoma State minus the points. We've seen action come in on Pittsburgh this week. I think that's a slight overreaction. I think that that's that the money's going the wrong way. The game opened Oklahoma State 6.5. We see 6s across, and a very key offshore book, Chris, has moved it down to 5. So somebody with an account there did some damage on the Pittsburgh side. But I think for various reasons, you got to look the Oklahoma State way here. First off, just the situation it dictates a play on Oklahoma State. You've got Pittsburgh heading into that Penn State game last week with head coach Pat Narduzzi telling all the local media, the national media, that his team treated that game like a rivalry. They hadn't played that game since the year 2000. It was 16 years since those two in-state universities met, and Narduzzi and his team took it as serious could be. They want to rekindle the rivalry. I think they signed a 4-year contract against one another. And the complete opposite of that was James Franklin and his team. What he told his team, it's just another game. This is not a rivalry. James Franklin was a little out of touch at the beginning of that game because Pittsburgh came out and they were fired up. They ran off to a big lead. But Penn State came back, and they came back through the air, Rob, and I think that's the key here. If you're looking for a fundamental edge in this game, you're looking for the Oklahoma State quarterback, Mason Rudolph, and their passing game against that Pittsburgh defense, because Trace McSorley, the quarterback for Penn State, he might fit the system because he can run well, but he's not Mason Rudolph. His arm strength is, let's give him average, mediocre. He underthrew a lot of balls in their opener against Kent State. Throws that could have been touchdowns. They've got a talented wide receiving core. They've got a nice running back in Saquon Barkley, who's probably the best offensive player on their side. But when Trace McSorley and the Penn State offensive line, which is still not very good, it's improved, but it's not very good, when they can come back from a multi-touchdown deficit, and they can do that through the air, he threw for well over 300 yards in that game. I think that exposed something right then and there. If you're Pittsburgh and you're up as big as you were up in that game, it's time to pin your ears down and go get the quarterback. They couldn't do it. Like I say, Mason Rudolph and the Oklahoma State team are far more advanced as far as passing game goes, and I think they're going to take advantage of Pitt here. I think Pitt, obviously coming off that maximum effort, treated it like a rivalry. Now they go travel to Oklahoma State. Says there's a bit of a letdown there. And the other side, Oklahoma State, chomping at the bit, can't wait to get back on the field in front of their home fans and get themselves a win. It's their third consecutive home game in a row, I believe. So, I think fundamentally it works for Oklahoma State. What they're going to have to do is they're going to have to do what everybody knows they have to do, stack the box, get on James Conner, make sure that they don't run right through Oklahoma State like Swiss cheese. I believe they can do it. Nate Peterman in that passing game for Pitt has been non-existent through 2 weeks. And with as good as their running game is, you would think they'd be able to throw off of it, but it was lousy in week 1. It was lousy against Penn State. I don't know how it's going to get any better on the road here. They're really a one-dimensional offensive team. So I think there's a lot of arrows, a lot of signals that point toward the Oklahoma State side, and I'm kind of happy that the numbers come down. Maybe we can get to 5 universally and really take a good whack at it. But I thought at -6 when I wrote the free play up that Oklahoma State was a good side. So maybe Derek will be in agreement with that. Maybe he won't. But I think the Cowboys are a good side.
And, Rob, if I recall correctly, you hit on your free play last week with Penn State covering the number against Pitt, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, we used against Pitt 2 weeks in a row now. A lot of the stuff I just said now was what I believed in the Penn State-Pittsburgh game, that Penn State, especially the fact, Robin, we'll watch it closer. I wasn't as sure last week as I am this week that Pittsburgh is a one-dimensional offensive football team. In that opening game, you just don't know because they were playing a lesser opponent. You're not real sure if Pittsburgh is keeping the offense simplified so Penn State doesn't see anything. They really didn't throw the ball downfield at all, Pittsburgh didn't, in that opener. But then when you come back and see them again with the same exact game plan, you start to think to yourself, they can't throw the football. So they have to be predicated on the run, and teams will catch on. And they're playing in a tough conference. They're playing a tough team here. They played a tough team last week. They kind of caught Penn State, like I say, early and did a lot of their damage early because after they got that big lead, Penn State certainly. And Penn State had a chance at the end, right, to kick a game-tying field goal. So we were successful with that one. I think we're going to be successful here with this free play, too, on Oklahoma State.
And for anybody looking for all of Rob's power ratings and information, you need to get over to the website, robvinosports.com. It really is just a great source of handicapping information for you. The site will give you game day weather as the weekend gets closer. It will have the power ratings. It'll show you historical numbers. It really is a phenomenal resource, and I can't say enough about the great quality of work and the amount of work that goes into creating all of this for you, and it's all available for free. And then, of course, you can get my plays, you can get Rob's plays, you can get Derek's plays at robvinosports.com. Rob, any parting words for us this evening?
Yeah, not too much. I think we just have to, we're through overreaction Saturday, and now I think we've learned a little bit more, but you and I discussed, as far as major schools are concerned, and power teams in the NCAA, what we're looking for this week. Don't leave out the little teams. When you're playing these games, there's just as much value in these non-power conference games as there is in the big ones. In fact, there's probably more because odds makers' lines aren't as tight. So if there's any advice for betting guys out there heading into week 3, make sure you take a look at everything out there. We try our best, as Rob just said, to be a good resource for the entire 128-team FBS, to give you some sort of knowledge on every single team out there. I know we don't discuss the lesser games during the podcast each week, but we try to provide it in number form for you on the website. So once again,
and it is all there. The same information that Rob has on the website for Bama and Ole Miss is available for Boston College and Virginia Tech and some of these other games that there's really East Carolina, South Carolina, New Mexico State, Kentucky. I mean, we can name them all. There's information there on all of them, and it is really good stuff. I'd recommend getting over to robdinosports.com and checking it out. Rob, if you don't have anything else for us, that will close it out for this week.
Yeah, and thanks a lot again for joining me here, Rob, as we go through the weekly segment. And hopefully, between you and I, we're at least getting one or two things across to listeners that maybe they didn't know before they tuned in. That's always the objective.
We can hope for that, and we thank everybody for listening. Remember, robdinosports.com is the spot for all of your handicapping needs. All of our plays are available there, and we will be back next week to take a look back at what we saw in a huge Week 3 and preview some Week 4 college football games. For Rob Dino, I'm Rob O'Connor of robdinosports.com. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.